So I want to start by telling you a story. 6 years ago, my cousins, who live in inner metropolitan Melbourne, woke up to a day that they would never forget afterwards. My cousin Jimmy was the first one to smell smoke and to see the flames that started engulfing their family home, and he ran down the corridor raising the alarm, yelling to his parents and to my other cousin to get up, to get out of bed. The house was on fire. They all managed to get out in time, and they stood there on the pavement watching the place in which they'd become a family crumble in front of them. The relief of having escaped quickly gave way to shock over the magnitude of what had happened. And it wasn't just about the house, it was about the loss of everything that they loved and owned. The kids' first drawings, family photos, books collected over the decades. And then there were the intangibles. There was the backyard where we'd had countless birthdays in, the living room where spectacular blanket forts were created and destroyed in epic battles. And I learned a number of lessons that day and also in the days and weeks that followed. I learned the importance of community ties. After that happened, everyone rallied around their family. There were email lists that went out asking what the family needed. People who, I've got a spare bed in the garage. I've got spare clothes. Does anyone wear size 10? Anything that you can share. People offering spare bedrooms. And I really learnt the value of community at that time. I learnt how much we take for granted our precious items after we'd helped them out in getting the basics back. What we realised was what they didn't have was some of those things that couldn't be replaced. And I remember my mother looking through our family albums and meticulously scanning each of the photos which had their family in it and creating for them the albums or a relic of the albums of which that they had lost. And I remember my mum saying at the time as well that it could have just as easily have happened to us. And I think that some of the motivation for her as well was the realisation that had it been us, we wouldn't have been prepared. I learnt that day how unexpectedly and quickly emergencies can happen. We'd caught up with their family just the week prior and been sitting around having a long lazy lunch on the Sunday, and so quickly things had changed. And I learnt how easy it was not to think about emergencies until they happened to you or to someone you know. What I didn't know that day was that these are also the ideas that sit at the cornerstone of the Red Cross Preparedness Program. And that the Red Cross Preparedness Program was very much founded on the experiences that our teams have had working in relief and recovery, hearing from people as they lament the things that they wish that they'd done, the things that they wish they'd known before an emergency. And it's in this way that I guess you can say that the Red Cross Preparedness Program really provides a voice to all of those who've been through an emergency, issuing an immensely poignant and practical call to action. Working for Red Cross in emergency services has been a dream that I've held for a very long time. Like many aspiring humanitarians, I embarked on a global arts degree studying politics, languages, international studies. And in my final year, I took a class on global disasters. And in this class, there was an idea presented which set me on this trajectory to work in disaster management. The idea was that there is no such thing as natural disasters. The idea is that there are natural hazards, but that disasters only occur when the hazards intersect with people. This idea rocked me to my core, and everything that I thought that I knew about disasters. It offered a human-centred approach to their management, suggesting that we are empowered to make decisions about where we live, how we build, and what we do ahead of a hazard to support people in our community. Totally inspired by this idea, I started looking at emergency management agencies and their respective approaches. And what I found was an industry that was largely dominated by response and relief agencies. Red Cross, however, stuck out as an organisation that shared this human-centred approach, an organisation that worked before, during and after an emergency and recognised the importance of that holistic approach to disaster management. What they also recognised was that the importance of building resilience as opposed to just coming in after an emergency to help with the mop-up. The Red Cross job site became the most visited page on my laptop, and I signed up as an emergency services volunteer, really hoping to get a foot in the door of this industry that I had a sense was going to become a career for me. As a volunteer, the lessons that I'd learned through my cousin's experience with their house fire were reinforced on a number of occasions. While conducting outreach in the Blue Mountains 18 months on from bushfires, I spoke with a man who told me he just could not believe how tough recovery really was. 18 months on, he was still dealing with insurance agencies, he was still grieving the loss of his animals, and he was still working to rebuild his livelihood. And this emphasised to me just how long the impacts of an event like this can really linger. Another story that really stayed with me was a colleague of mine who was working in WA after the fires there, and she was working in an evacuation centre, and she said a woman came into this evacuation centre carrying a pair of heels and 2 swimsuits. And as she sat and she talked to her, and as this woman was coming to terms to what had happened, having had to have left her home so quickly, what came out was that front of mind had been the cruise that she was about to go on in a few days' time, and that was all she could think about in the stress of the moment of having to leave quickly. And as they continued talking, she started mentally walking through her home, which she didn't know if it was standing anymore, and identifying the things that she wished she'd picked up and the things she wished she'd taken, including, for example, the passport that she would have needed for which to go on the cruise. So what this really highlighted as well was the importance of not just being prepared, but having something like a grab kit and having thought in advance about what you'd take with you if you need to leave quickly. So I took up a Master's in Emergency Management and Community Development, studying by distance while working full-time. So by night and through weekends, really having a growing appreciation and understanding of the social and economic, political and cultural context of disasters, and the importance of building resilience, enabling people to bounce back, or as some people like to say, bounce forward from an emergency. When an opportunity arose to join the National Recovery Team as a volunteer research intern, I seized the chance, and to the point where I actually dropped down from working full-time to work, and I spoke with my employer about working 4 days a week so that I could volunteer a day here at Red Cross, and they were very aware that this was my passion and were very supportive of it. And so it came that I came to be that I was volunteering with Red Cross in a day a week, and was fortunate enough to be working on a really fascinating project with them, doing research and later facilitating a roundtable looking at the role that non-traditional disaster agencies such as Red Cross can play working with some of the more traditional stakeholders. And we brought some of the brightest minds in a room together and had some really great discussions which were then captured in this research report. I'd love to say that it was an easy way into Red Cross from there, but I must have applied for about 5 or 6 other roles before eventually landing a role with the National Preparedness Team. But each time I told myself that this was a sector that was all about resilience, and I just needed to keep on bouncing back. So with the National Preparedness Team, I had the opportunity to work directly with resilience building efforts. Some of this work included refreshing our key preparedness tool, Ready Plan, so that it worked as a complementary resource to other industry guides. I was also involved in devising a behavioural change model, which was really about us understanding, I guess from a health promotions perspective, what it is that makes people change their mind and decide to start adopting a behaviour, and that really served as, I guess, one of the foundations for a lot of the work that we do. I was also involved in redeveloping our national preparedness in education program, and through that pulling together anecdotes and key messages, engaging activities together in a package that our state and territory teams now use across the country when they go out and talk about preparedness. What I like most about what we do at Red Cross is that it's so relevant. At this time all over the world, we're facing more intense weather events more frequently. Moreover, while people are more connected than they've ever been to one another, thanks to globalisation and everything that it's brought with it, at the same time people report being more isolated than they've ever been. And in all Red Cross community programs, we highlight resilience as a key outcome that we work to build in individuals and communities. And a way in which this manifests in emergency services is that we work to help people get connected and to build strong communal ties, like Pete did. So Pete is a shift worker who I met doing outreach in the Blue Mountains again, and he and his wife, they were home the day that the 2013 bushfires started. There was a heat wave outside, it must have been about 40 degrees, and they were inside with the curtains shut, they're watching movies, the air conditioner blasting. Now a neighbour who knew that they were shift workers came and knocked on their door knowing that it was unlikely that they'd heard the bushfire warnings. And when Pete and Julie stepped outside of their home, suddenly they could smell the smoke and they could see the flames in the valley below. And thanks to those neighbour connections, they were able to leave, and they survived thanks to knowing their neighbours. In New South Wales, we know that the ratio of emergency services staff to residents is something like 1 to 400. Too often we meet people who think that they don't need an emergency plan because the fireys or the police will come and knock on their door and tell them when it's time to leave. But what we know is that it's much more likely to be a neighbour or a passerby who's going to help out during an emergency. I'll leave you today with a few words about my vision for where we're headed in emergency management at Red Cross. Prince Charles once said in his quaint British way, "There's nothing like a jolly good disaster to get people to start doing something." And this was certainly the case for my cousins, and as it is for a lot of other people that we meet through the course of the work that we do at Red Cross. Our vision in emergency services is that people won't need to go through an emergency themselves to catalyse them getting prepared. The idea that gets me out of bed each day is that while there are natural hazards, there are also human ways of mitigating against and preparing for these hazards. And we promote these ways daily through our preparedness program. I work each day to try and help build a culture around preventative action. And I don't think that this is a far-fetched vision. Before the early 70s, nobody wore seatbelts in cars. It wasn't part of the culture. But with a growing awareness for how these could save lives, it was enshrined into culture and law. And today we don't think twice about belting up when we get in a car. So if I could encourage you to do one thing today, it's to make a plan for emergencies. And together, I hope that we can make emergency preparedness the seatbelts of the 21st century. Thank you.